If you are feeling bored and having a bad day, sit down and watch Smokey and the Bandit. It will cheer you up almost immediately. There are movies you watch out of curiosity. There are movies you watch and then forget. But there are also movies that the moment you turn them on, take you right back to another time. A place where the highway seems endless, the radio is always playing, and a beautiful car can light up the entire screen. That is the kind of movie that came out of a very specific era of Hollywood, a little looser, a little dustier, and sometimes a whole lot more spontaneous. But here is something interesting. Movies that feel that fun and effortless sometimes end up having the strangest behind-the-scenes stories. So in this video, we are going to look back at Smokey and the Bandit and uncover 20 little-known facts behind a film that almost everyone thinks they already know. Number 20. Burt Reynolds once called the Smokey and the Bandit script the worst he had ever read, and his friends even knelt down begging him not to take the film. If you have ever watched Smokey and the Bandit, you will probably react the same way I did the first time I heard this story. The worst. That sounds impossible, because this movie with that black Trans Am flying down the road and Burt Reynolds flashing that half-mischievous, half-carefree grin does not look like a bad project at all. But when Hal Needham first brought the script to Reynolds, things were very different. The draft was not a neatly typed screenplay. It was written on yellow legal pads, more like a stack of notes than a movie ready to be made. Reynolds read it and gave a very honest reaction. Years later, he said it was almost the worst script he had ever read in his life, and he was not the only one who thought that. According to stories Reynolds later told his friends, reacted even more dramatically. Some of them literally knelt down and begged him not to do the movie. In their eyes, joining that project looked like a reckless career decision. These kinds of contradictions are not unusual in cultural history. Arthur Conan Doyle once grew so tired of Sherlock Holmes that he tried to kill the character off at the Reichenbach Falls. But the audience had very different ideas. Reynolds was in a similar situation. He did not accept the movie because he believed in the script. He accepted it because he believed in Hal Needham. The two had been close friends for years, and Reynolds trusted that if Needham was behind the project, at the very least, the movie would have its own spirit. And the rest, of course, is history. Smokey and the Bandit eventually became one of the biggest box office hits of 1977, second only to Star Wars. And if the movie was already being called a terrible idea at the beginning, the things that happened afterward are even harder to believe. Number 19. The scene where the car crashes into the dugout was actually a real accident. There is a moment in Smokey and the Bandit that always makes me wince a little when I watch it again, because it feels so real. The Trans Am suddenly crashes straight into a baseball dugout, like the driver lost control for just a split second. At first glance, it looks like a stunt carefully staged to make the chase feel more chaotic. But the story behind it is a little different. During filming, the stunt car reportedly slid on wet grass and slammed into the dugout unexpectedly. It was not a stunt calculated down to the last centimeter, like many of the other car chases in the film. It was a genuine mistake that happened right in the middle of shooting. Normally, an accident like that would make the crew stop, repair the set, and shoot the scene again. But Hal Needham was not the kind of director who liked everything too polished. Before becoming a director, he had been one of Hollywood's most famous stuntmen. He understood that sometimes real chaos can create a kind of authenticity no script can write. So when the crew reviewed the footage, they decided to keep it. They reinforced the set shot a few extra angles and turned that unexpected crash into part of the chase sequence in the movie. And that is also one of the reasons Smokey and the Bandit always feels a little wild and unpredictable. Sometimes real-life mistakes end up becoming the most memorable moments on screen. Number 18. Many people have actually never heard Sheriff Buford T. Justice's real voice. If you grew up in America in the 1980s and first watched Smokey and the Bandit on television, there is a surprisingly good chance you have never heard the real voice of Sheriff Buford T. Justice. It sounds strange, but the story begins with something very familiar in television at the time: censorship. In the original 1977 theatrical release, Jackie Gleason's character Buford often blurts out the line "sumbitch." That phrase is a big part of the character's hot-tempered and slightly rough personality. But when the movie aired on television, lines like that could not stay the same, so they were replaced with a softer version, "scumbum." That one small change already made the character sound much less explosive. But the story does not end there. In some broadcast versions, Jackie Gleason did not record all the replacement dialogue himself. Some of the altered lines were dubbed by Henry Corden, the voice actor famous for playing Fred Flintstone. That creates a strange little paradox. Many viewers grew up watching Smokey and the Bandit on TV, but the Buford T. Justice they remember is not entirely Jackie Gleason's Buford. It is a softened version that sometimes even carries someone else's voice. Number 17. The chemistry between Burt Reynolds and Sally Field was not just acting. Some movies create chemistry only on screen. Smokey and the Bandit went a step further. During the filming of the movie, Burt Reynolds and Sally Field actually began developing feelings for each other in real life. The film was not only their first time acting together, it also became the starting point for one of Hollywood's most talked about relationships at the time. After this movie, the two continued appearing together in several other projects, and in the eyes of audiences, they almost became inseparable as a screen couple. Number 16. Burt Reynolds was promised a Trans Am every year for life, but the promise was never kept. Most of us have heard a promise like this at some point: "If this works out, I will reward you big." Sound familiar? After Smokey and the Bandit became a box office sensation. In 1977, Burt Reynolds became almost inseparable from the black and gold Pontiac Trans Am. For many viewers, Bandit and that car were practically the same image, and Pontiac clearly understood that. The movie helped turn the car into a pop culture icon. According to many behind-the-scenes stories repeated later, the president of General Motors at the time told Reynolds he would always have a brand new Trans Am every year for the rest of his life. It sounded like the perfect reward for the man who had accidentally promoted the car better than any advertising campaign ever could. But after that executive passed away, the promise more or less disappeared with him. No one else in the company continued honoring it, and Burt Reynolds ultimately had to buy his own Trans Ams. Number 15. Sally Field almost lost the role because she was considered not sexy enough. It is hard to imagine the movie without Sally Field. Her character Carrie, or Frog, feels like the perfect match for Burt Reynolds' Bandit. But during casting, not everyone saw it that way. In an interview years later on the Today Show, Burt Reynolds recalled that some people involved in the production were not enthusiastic about casting Sally Field. The reason sounds very familiar in old Hollywood thinking. They believed she was not sexy enough for the role. Hearing that today sounds a little ridiculous. But in the late 1970s, casting decisions like that were not unusual. Reynolds saw something different. When he heard those objections, he gave a very simple reply. Talent is sexy. He insisted that Sally Field should play Carrie. And looking back now, it is hard to imagine what the movie would have been like if the decision had gone another way. Field brought a charm, intelligence, and energy to the role that made the Bandit and Carrie partnership come alive on screen. The performance even helped earn her a Golden Globe nomination later on. Number 14. To get that famous jump, the film almost destroyed its own Trans Am. If there is one moment in Smokey and the Bandit that still makes people hold their breath, even after seeing the movie many times, it is probably the famous bridge jump with the Trans Am. The moment happens very quickly on screen. The black and gold car races forward, leaves the road and sails through the air before crashing down on the other side. But behind those few seconds is a stunt that was anything but gentle. The jump was performed by stuntman Alan Gibbs. According to production records, the Trans Am flew about 70 feet before hitting the ground, and the car used for that stunt did not really survive the landing. To capture those few unforgettable seconds, the production was willing to sacrifice its own iconic vehicle. And what makes the story even more surprising is that all of those stunts were performed while the film was operating with a budget that was not nearly as generous as many people assume. Number 13. Universal suddenly cut $1 million from the budget just 2 days before filming. When you watch Smokey and the Bandit, it feels like a movie made with complete freedom. Cars racing everywhere, chase scenes one after another, everything looking as if the crew had plenty of time and money to do whatever they wanted. But the truth behind the scenes was very different. Originally, Universal approved a budget of about $5.3 million. For an action film filled with car chases, that was not huge, but it was enough for the production to follow its plan. Then, just 2 days before cameras were scheduled to start rolling, the studio made a decision that stunned the entire crew. $1 million was cut from the budget. After Burt Reynolds' salary was paid, the actual amount left to make the film dropped to around $3.3 million. For Hal Needham, who was directing his first film and preparing to shoot a movie full of car chases, it was almost an impossible challenge. Needham and the assistant director reportedly spent hours rewriting the entire shooting schedule, cutting whatever they could, and reorganizing each day of filming so the movie could still move forward. Number 12. Sally Field joined Smokey and the Bandit when the script was barely finished. Normally, a film begins with a complete script. The actors read it, the director plans everything, and then production begins. Smokey and the Bandit almost worked the opposite way. When Burt Reynolds called Sally Field to invite her to join the project, the movie barely had a finished script. Years later, during a conversation with Oprah, Field explained very honestly that when she stepped into the film, they really only had an idea and a few pages of writing. The rest slowly came together right there on set. That meant many of the conversations between Bandit and Carrie were not written in advance. They were improvised while filming as the actors reacted to each other in front of the camera. Looking back at the movie today, that explains quite a lot. The dialogue between the two characters often feels natural and almost spontaneous, and as it turns out, that is exactly what it was. Number 11. Even the theatrical version of Smokey and the Bandit was already sneaking around censorship from the very beginning. If you think censorship only happened when the movie hit television, Smokey and the Bandit was actually pulling a sly little trick right there in the theatrical cut. There is a moment in the film when Jackie Gleason's Sheriff Buford T. Justice seems to blurt out a very strong curse, but at that exact moment, the sound of a siren or a passing truck covers the most important word. You still know exactly what he meant to say, but technically, the audience never actually hears it. This was not a sound accident. Many accounts of the production suggest it was a very clever way for the movie to skate right along the edge of censorship without actually crossing it. The line kept its comic rhythm, the character kept his hot-tempered personality, but the movie did not get pushed into a harsher rating. In other words, Smokey and the Bandit already knew how to mess with the rules from the minute it hit theaters. By the way, we have now made it exactly halfway through the list. If you are enjoying these stories behind the movie, take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel before we keep counting down the remaining 10 facts. And trust me, a few of them are even harder to believe than what we have already covered. Number 10. Jackie Gleason had his own code word on set: hamburger. On the set of Smokey and the Bandit, Jackie Gleason had a pretty interesting code word. If he said hamburger, everybody around him immediately understood one thing: he did not actually want a hamburger. What he really meant was a glass of bourbon. This is exactly the kind of story you expect from old Hollywood. Big stars often had their own habits on set, and the whole crew gradually learned those little private rules. For Gleason, hamburger was simply a discreet way to ask for a drink. And if you think back to the way Sheriff Buford T. Justice growls through the whole movie, it is probably not too hard to imagine that the man playing him in real life had a pretty unruly style of his own. But the interesting stories around this movie do not stop on the set, because Smokey and the Bandit also had one very unexpected fan, a director you probably would not guess would love a car chase movie like this. Ready for fact number 9. Number 9, Alfred Hitchcock was reportedly a big fan of Smokey and the Bandit. Here is a pretty fascinating fact that surprises a lot of people. One of the reported fans of Smokey and the Bandit was none other than Alfred Hitchcock. That sounds a little strange at first. Hitchcock was the master of tense, carefully constructed films like Psycho and Vertigo. Meanwhile, Smokey and the Bandit is loud, funny, rowdy, and built around a car chase. But according to many stories repeated around Hollywood, Hitchcock genuinely loved the movie. People say that in the final years of his life, he would often screen Smokey and the Bandit in his office just for fun. Some sources even claim Hitchcock watched it almost every week, and that it was one of the last films he screened in his office before he died. It sounds surprising, but maybe after an entire career spent keeping audiences tense every minute, Hitchcock also needed a movie that was simply there to have fun. And speaking of Bandit's Trans Am, there is one detail a lot of viewers never notice: the engine sound you hear in the movie is not actually the real sound of that car. Number 8. The engine sound of the Trans Am in the movie is not entirely its real sound. If there is one thing in Smokey and the Bandit that audiences never forget, besides the black and gold car, it is the sound. Every time Bandit hits the gas, the Trans Am lets out this fierce growl. That sound almost becomes part of the character itself: rough, powerful, and pure muscle car. But there is one detail most people do not realize. The engine sound you hear in the movie is not entirely the real sound of the Trans Am you see on screen. During post-production, the filmmakers mixed in sound from another car to make Bandit's car sound stronger and meaner. That is actually a pretty common technique in movies. Sometimes the real sound of a car just does not hit hard enough on screen, so filmmakers boost it or replace parts of it to give the audience a stronger feeling. Number 7. Sally Field once thought, doing Smokey and the Bandit might be a huge career mistake. Sometimes in a career there are decisions where the second you say yes, you start wondering, what did I just do? For Sally Field, Smokey and the Bandit was once one of those moments. Field later admitted that right after accepting the role of Carrie, she worried that this movie might be the wrong move. At the time, she was trying to build a more serious image after her earlier television roles. A loud, funny car chase movie like Smokey and the Bandit was not exactly the direction she thought she should be heading. In her mind, this decision could actually throw her career off course. But history has a very interesting way of answering those kinds of fears. Just 2 years after the movie came out, Sally Field won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Norma Rae. That role did not just bring her the biggest prize in film, it also confirmed her place as a serious actress in Hollywood. In other words, the movie she once feared might damage her career ended up damaging nothing at all. And if Sally Field once thought she had stepped into a bad decision, the Trans Am in this movie went through a rough fate of its own, because by the end of filming, even the movie's biggest symbol was almost too worn out to run anymore. Number 6. By the final scene, the legendary Trans Am could almost no longer start on its own. If you remember the final scene of Smokey and the Bandit, everything looks clean and effortless. The Trans Am stops. Burt Reynolds steps out, flashes that familiar smile, and the movie wraps up like everything went perfectly. But by the time they were shooting those final scenes, the last remaining Trans Am on the production had almost been completely worn out. After all the chase scenes, jumps, and stunt work throughout filming, the movie's iconic car was nearly too exhausted to start under its own power. According to Hal Needham later on, by the time they got to the last scene, the car simply would not go anymore. So the crew had to do something very few viewers would ever imagine. They used another vehicle to push the Trans Am into position, so Burt Reynolds could step out of it as if everything were perfectly normal. On screen, it is Bandit's legendary car. In real life, it was almost being dragged across the finish line. We have only got 5 facts left now, and trust me, the stories ahead are even crazier than what we have just uncovered. Number 5. Many of Sheriff Buford T. Justice's classic funny moments were never in the script. If there is one character in Smokey and the Bandit who always feels impossible to predict, it is definitely Jackie Gleason's Sheriff Buford T. Justice. Part of the reason is pretty simple. A lot of what Buford does in the movie was never in the script. Jackie Gleason was famous for being an actor who loved to improvise. On set, he often did not stick to the dialogue word for word. Instead, he let the character react on instinct and allowed the camera to catch those moments. One of the best-known examples is a tiny detail that is still incredibly funny: the piece of toilet paper hanging out of Buford's pant leg. That was not a scripted gag. It was one of Gleason's improvised bits, and the filmmakers decided to keep it because it fit the character so perfectly. That style of acting is exactly what makes Buford T. Justice feel so alive and just a little dangerous in a very funny way. You never know what he is going to yell next, or what ridiculous thing he is going to do in the middle of a chase. Number 4. The 2006 DVD of Smokey and the Bandit frustrated a lot of fans because it changed the original sound. Normally, when a movie gets remastered, audiences expect the picture and sound to get better. But with Smokey and the Bandit, the 2006 Special Edition DVD got a very different reaction. During the process of upgrading the soundtrack to 5.1, many of the movie's original sound effects were changed. That included engine sounds, brake sounds, and even some of the familiar highway audio. For a movie that lives on speed and cars, that is not a small detail. Some longtime fans even said the Trans Am in the newer DVD no longer sounded like the car they remembered in their heads. It is a pretty interesting example of how classic movies work. Sometimes the film is still the same, but a new release can make the audience's memory of it sound different. Number 3. Before it became contraband in the movie, Coors was already something powerful people in real life were chasing down. If you watch Smokey and the Bandit today, the idea of driving across states just to haul Coors beer sounds a little crazy. But in the 1970s, that was not really such a strange idea. At the time, Coors was distributed almost exclusively in a limited number of western states. In many places back east, you simply could not buy it in a store. Because of that, Coors slowly became a kind of special commodity. If somebody managed to bring back a few cases from Colorado, people treated it almost like a trophy. And the interesting part is that this craze was not limited to ordinary people. In many stories told about that era, even famous and powerful figures were said to find ways to bring Coors into places where it was hard to get. People have said Gerald Ford brought Coors back to Washington. Dwight Eisenhower had his own ways of getting it, and Henry Kissinger was reportedly known to bring Coors back after trips to California. Even Paul Newman has been mentioned as somebody who really liked Coors and wanted to keep it around. It sounds funny now. An ordinary beer, somehow becoming the thing presidents and movie stars both wanted to bring home. Number 2. Smokey and the Bandit became such a huge hit that Hollywood started copying it shamelessly. When a movie becomes a major hit, Hollywood usually does the familiar thing: make a sequel. But sometimes the industry moves even faster than that. It starts copying. After Smokey and the Bandit exploded at the box office in 1977, the word Smokey suddenly became hot. Audiences loved the chases, loved the muscle cars, and loved the movie's unruly spirit. Other studios noticed that very quickly. There were even movies that originally had nothing to do with Bandit, but were later reworked and released under titles that sounded more like Smokey and the Bandit just to cash in on the craze. One example people often mention is the Great Smokey Roadblock. According to records from the American Film Institute, that movie was re-edited and retitled to directly echo the Smokey fever sweeping theaters at the time. In other words, just putting the word Smokey in the title suddenly gave a movie a better shot at selling tickets. But Hollywood copying it was only the outward sign. The real numbers behind Smokey and the Bandit were even crazier than that. Because when this movie hit theaters in 1977, it did something almost nobody thought was possible. And that brings us to the final fact on this list. Number 1. Universal first treated Smokey and the Bandit like a Southern card, then realized they were holding a box office monster. Looking back today, it is easy to assume Universal knew from the start that they had a major hit on their hands with Smokey and the Bandit. But the truth is, when the movie was getting ready for release in 1977, Universal did not roll it out like a nationwide blockbuster. Instead, the studio used a strategy that was fairly unusual at the time, a regional release. The movie opened first in southern states, where the culture of muscle cars, highways, and bandit-style chases was considered more likely to connect with audiences. In other words, Smokey and the Bandit was originally treated almost like a regional specialty picture. Then, something interesting happened. The movie started exploding in those markets. Audiences packed theaters, word of mouth spread quickly, and Universal realized they were holding something much bigger than they had expected. The film expanded nationwide, and in just one summer, Smokey and the Bandit became a massive box office phenomenon. In fact, in 1977, it finished as the #2 movie in America by box office, gross second only to one small film you may have heard of, Star Wars. Not bad at all for a movie. Burt Reynolds himself once thought had the worst script he had ever read. And maybe that is exactly what makes Smokey and the Bandit such a strange Hollywood legend. A movie that started as a small gamble and ended like a box office storm. Looking back today, Smokey and the Bandit is not just a fun 1970s car chase movie. It feels more like a spark that made a lot of people want to get in a car and head straight for the highway. After the movie came out, some drivers actually said they tried doing exactly that. They took long drives simply because the movie made everything look so loose and free. And then they quickly discovered something kind of funny. Real life is not really like the movie. There are no perfect car jumps. There is no Trans Am roaring the way it does in the theater. And there is definitely no Sheriff Buford T justice chasing you across 3 states. But that is exactly the charm of this film. It turns an ordinary drive into an adventure. If you also love behind-the-scenes stories and classic movies, like this, subscribe to the channel and stay with this nostalgia series. We have still got a lot of great movies left to dig back into.